The midnight knock. It was a cold, rainy night when Julie moved into her new home, a modest little house nestled deep in the woods. She'd been looking for peace and quiet, a break from the chaos of the city. But as soon as she arrived, something felt. The house was old, with creaking floors and walls that seemed to whisper in the wind. At first, Julie told herself it was just her imagination. Moving into a new place always felt a little strange. She unpacked, made herself a cup of tea, and settled into bed early, letting the sound of the rain lull her to sleep. But then, at exactly midnight, she heard it 3 slow, deliberate knocks at her front door. Julie sat up, heart pounding. Who would be out in the middle of the woods at this hour? She crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. No one was there. The rain continued to pour, and the forest outside was pitch black. Shaking her head, she went back to bed, blaming it on the wind or an animal brushing against the door. The next night it happened again. 3 knocks. This time Julie didn't hesitate. She grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. "Hello," she called out, but the only response was the sound of rain and the rustling of trees. She couldn't shake the unease. The knocks were too precise, too intentional. It wasn't the wind. On the 3rd night, Julie decided to stay awake, determined to catch whoever or whatever was behind it. She sat in her living room with the lights off, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. Midnight came, and like clockwork, 3 knocks echoed through the house. Her breath caught. This time the sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back. Julie's hands trembled as she moved toward the kitchen, where the back door was located. The knocking came again, louder this time, almost impatient. She turned the handle and flung the door open, but there was no one there. As she stood in the doorway, her flashlight flickered, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped outside, shining the light around. That's when she saw them wet footprints leading away from the door, disappearing into the woods. Julie slammed the door and locked it, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself it was a prank, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next morning, she called the local police, who came out to investigate. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. One officer, an older man, pulled her aside as the others searched. "You live out here alone?" he asked. Julie nodded. He hesitated, then said, "A few years back, there was a man who lived in this house. He went missing and they never found him. People around here say his spirit still lingers, looking for company." Julie laughed nervously, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't joking. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room with every light on, gripping her flashlight like a lifeline. Midnight came, and for the first time in days, there was silence. No knocks, no sounds at all, except for the rain. She let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But as she turned off the lights and headed to bed, she heard it. Not at the door this time, but inside the house. 3 knocks, coming from her bedroom closet. Julie froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Slowly, she turned the knob and opened the closet door. It was empty except for a single wet footprint on the wooden floor. The knocks continued every night after that. No matter where she went, no matter how many locks she used, they always found her. And if you ever find yourself alone at midnight, listening to the rain, be careful. Because sometimes the knock isn't asking for permission to come in. It's already there. The whispering shadows. Have you ever been awake at night, staring into the darkness, feeling like something is watching you? This story might make you think twice about what's really out there when the lights go out. It began with an apartment that no one wanted to rent. The listing stayed up for months, cheap, spacious, but with a single warning, the last tenant left in the middle of the night and never returned. When Emily, a struggling art student, saw the price, she didn't care about the warning. A ghost story, she laughed. I'll take it she moved in that weekend. The apartment was perfect, high ceilings, large windows, and a quiet neighborhood. But on the first night, something felt off. The air was thick, as if it hadn't been touched in years. And then there were the shadows. They seemed darker, heavier, and they didn't move with the light. At first, Emily brushed it off as paranoia. But as the days went on, the feeling grew worse. It started with whispers. At first, Emily thought it was the neighbors. Late at night, she would hear soft murmurs, like voices carrying through the walls. But when she pressed her ear to the walls, there was silence. Then, one night, she was painting in her living room when she noticed something strange. A shadow on the far wall stretched unnaturally long, almost like it was creeping toward her. She froze, staring at it, waiting for the light to shift and dissolve the illusion. But the shadow didn't move. She laughed nervously. "It's just my imagination," she said aloud. But as the words left her lips, the whispering returned closer this time. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was behind her. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. Only darkness. She turned on every light in the apartment and stayed up until morning, her heart racing with every creak of the floorboards. Over the next few nights, the shadows grew bolder. They flickered at the edges of her vision, moved where they shouldn't, and seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. Emily stopped sleeping, stopped painting, and started looking for another place to stay. But the apartment wasn't done with her. One night, as she packed her things to leave, the lights went out. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding her. "Don't leave," they hissed. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming shapes' faces. Their hollow eyes and stretched mouths seemed to suck the air from the room. Panicked, Emily ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the faces began to pull away from the walls, their shadowy forms reaching for her. And then, silence. Emily was found days later by a maintenance worker. Her belongings were still packed, but she was gone. The only thing left was her final painting, left on an easel in the center of the room. It showed a young woman trapped in a swirl of shadows, her face frozen in terror as dozens of hands reached for her. No one rents the apartment anymore. The landlord won't say why, but some nights, passers-by claim they hear whispers through the windows. And if you're ever awake in the dark, staring into the shadows of your own room, just remember, not all shadows stay still. The Silent Lodge. Have you ever stayed somewhere so quiet that it felt unnatural? A silence so deep it seemed alive, like the world itself was holding its breath. This is the story of what happens when silence isn't peaceful, it's predatory. It started as a getaway. 4 friends, Lena, Mark, Sarah, and Josh, decided to spend a weekend in a remote lodge deep in the mountains. The idea was simple: escape the noise of their daily lives, unplug, and reconnect with nature. Lena found the lodge online. It was cheap, secluded, and perfect for their needs. The drive up was uneventful, filled with laughter and plans for hiking, board games, and late-night ghost stories. But as they neared the lodge, the atmosphere began to shift. The forest grew denser, the air colder. Even the sun seemed to dim as they turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to their destination. When they arrived, the lodge looked exactly like the photos: rustic, yet charming, surrounded by towering pines. But something was off. There was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of wildlife. Just an oppressive, unnatural silence. "Guess it's really peaceful here," Mark joked, but his laugh felt hollow. Inside, the lodge was cozy but worn. The furniture was dated, the floors creaked, and the air carried a faint, musty smell. A handwritten note on the dining table welcomed them and mentioned a few rules. 1. Keep the curtains closed after sunset. 2. Do not go outside at night. 3. If you hear knocking, do not answer the door. "Is this a joke?" Sarah asked, holding up the note. "Probably just the owners trying to add a spooky vibe," Josh said. "Typical tourist trap stuff." They laughed it off and spent the afternoon settling in, hiking, and taking pictures of the stunning scenery. By the time night fell, the silence outside had grown heavier, almost suffocating. Lena closed the curtains as instructed, feeling a strange unease she couldn't shake. As they sat around the fireplace playing cards, she voiced her concerns. "Doesn't this place feel weird to you?" "It's just the quiet," Mark said. "We're not used to it. City life makes silence feel creepy." They agreed, but as the hours passed, the unease grew. Every creak of the lodge, every flicker of the firelight felt amplified in the oppressive stillness. Around midnight, they heard it. A faint, deliberate knock at the front door. The 4 friends froze, their eyes darting to the door. Josh, ever the skeptic, stood up. "Probably just the wind or an animal," he said, heading to the door. "Wait," Lena hissed. The note said not to answer it. Josh hesitated, then laughed nervously. You're not seriously buying into that, are you? The knock came again, louder this time. Josh, don't, Sarah whispered, gripping his arm. But he ignored her and opened the door. There was no one there, just the dark expanse of the forest and the cold wind pressing against his face. See? Nothing to worry about, he said, closing the door. But when he turned back, his face was pale. Josh? What's wrong? Lena asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he locked the door and muttered, Let's just go to bed. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the knocking, about the strange silence, about the rules. Then, just as she began to drift off, she heard it again. Knock. Knock, knock. This time it came from the window. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to see the silhouette of a figure standing just beyond the curtain, motionless. Lena, Sarah's voice whispered from across the room. Do you see it too? Lena nodded, too scared to speak. The figure began to knock again, rhythmic and patient. They stayed frozen, staring at the shadow until slowly it moved away. In the morning, Josh was gone. His bed was empty, his things untouched. The door was still locked, but his boots were missing. We have to leave, Lena said, her voice shaking. But when they tried to drive back, the gravel road seemed endless, looping them back to the lodge every time. By the third attempt, they were hysterical. That night, the knocking returned. This time it came from every window, every door. The figures outside were no longer silhouettes. They pressed against the glass, pale faces with hollow eyes and mouths stretched into grotesque grins. Mark snapped. He flung open the door and ran into the night, screaming at the figures to leave them alone. The door slammed shut behind him. The knocking stopped. For hours, Lena and Sarah sat in silence, clutching each other, too terrified to move. By dawn, there was no sign of Mark, only his muddy footprints leading into the woods. The next night was worse. The figures didn't wait for the knocking this time. They were inside the lodge. Lena and Sarah barricaded themselves in the bedroom, but it didn't matter. The figures stood at the edges of the room, watching, waiting. When the sun rose, Lena was alone. She never saw Sarah again, and no one believed her story when she was finally found wandering on the main road, hysterical and covered in scratches. The lodge remains abandoned, yet sometimes hikers report hearing faint knocks in the woods at night. And if you ever find yourself in a place too quiet, remember silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's a warning.